Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? I want to start today talking about a cool record I found. As you know, I'm trying to collect most of the label's early discographies. I found this early Atlantic, Ted Strader, and it's fun. He has a minimalist approach with his voice that actually punctuates the lyric and kind of takes some of the saccharine, sugary backgrounds and makes it a little bit more cold-hearted than blunt. His delivery, it's interesting. It's definitely champagne and caviar cocktail lounge. He played the Pro Room at the Plaza for a long time. He worked at Tin Pan Alley. He worked with some of the great songwriters like Irving Berlin, Rodgers and Hart. He worked with Paul Whiteman Orchestra for a while. He's also playing piano on this. It's a pretty tough record to come by. Lovely shot of New York in the background there. Certainly a guy who was white who made a living off black music. You know, Atlantic early on issues a lot of interesting artists, and that's part of what you get when you study the labels. Is you learn stuff. You know, I really actually enjoyed the record. It's got a pep to it. You know, and it has a poshness. Like I almost feel like I should have a monocle to really enjoy it, darling, because it's so fabulous. Could you pass me the caviar? Is my car outside ready and waiting? The high society crowd was obviously who he was playing for, and those places weren't going to hire no brothers, no way. And so, you know, you get it where you fit in, but it's a cool record, a cool piece of jazz history. It's definitely got some pop crossover to it, you know, but I actually enjoyed his voice quite a lot, and the great Mundell Lowe plays guitar on a lot of these tracks, and he's often the centerpiece that's fantastic and really a great listen. Mundell Lowe, of course, is a good friend of Bill Evans. Mundell Lowe was the one who recommended Bill Evans to Riverside Oregon Cape News, and of course that changes Evans' trajectory, not as much as Miles did, but Evans still became a much bigger figure, in part thanks to Mundell Lowe. So anyway, it's probably not for the guys who are into Wayne Shorter schizophrenia, but if you do like a nice light spritzy vocal record that you can play when you have some uncles and aunts over and you want to have some high life, darling, it'll be fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. This is a nice record for that type of a setting. You know, you have to have your fine china out, probably. You better bust out that silverware. You know what I mean? Don't be bringing me no regular little fork and nickel knife. I want some silver, maybe some gold-plated silverware. Do it right. I want some stuff a pirate would take from me. See what I'm saying? But it's a fun piece. And like I said, part of the joy that I get is learning as I go. So I'm almost done the 1200 series, the first 100. The first 5, 6 are actually a little bit mucky. Some of them are different formats. And then there's probably 5 titles I still need to find. And I think they get less and less jazzy as I go here with these last 5 or 6. But this was great. And so we're going to keep digging into that. Next we're going to talk about the aforementioned Miles Davis. And we're going to have the Siesta soundtrack playing in the background, which came from near the end of his career. And there's probably nothing I talk about that's more polarizing for people than Miles Davis. I try to often make people recognize that jazz is an emotional, contextual thing. It's revelatory, it speaks about who we are and our mindsets, and it's so powerful because of its honesty. What makes those Blue Note records isn't the watering down and trying to hide what we're saying. It's the direct honesty with no interlocutor between your soul and your conscience and your mouth. It just pours out. And due to its slightly coded nature, you can say the most honest and incredible things to the world for posterity's sake. And so jazz is very much one of the most honest art forms where you never have to compromise. And I've often said too that to hear jazz, you have to feel it. And there's three really great ways to feeling it: knowing an artist's environment, knowing an artist's experience within that environment, and then lastly, their personality. And a player's personality will go a long way into determining how they play, what they play, and the emotional texture that it's coming from. A player's personality, of course, it's a pretty tough record to find nowadays, this soundtrack, but a player's personality goes a long way in the dictation of what they're telling us. And I think there's nothing I've said more controversially to people, especially I think jazz newbies who are really immersed in the Miles universe, than saying that Miles wasn't the greatest guy. You know, Jean-Michel discussed the other day the Kenny Drew story, which I've told a couple times myself. Miles has his warts. And being middle class, affluent, black American, whose father was a dentist, he was always a bit of an outsider. He was never really embraced by the black community because he had a little too much money, didn't really know what the hood was like. And that can cause you to be somewhat ostracized because you have a bit of a superiority complex, and we don't really want to hear that or feel that. It makes us feel lesser than. And so therefore we're going to kind of keep you at arm's length. And Miles struggled with that greatly. And then the white America, he had very little time for. No matter how much money he had, he was still an N-word. And he was resentful of that. And these things, we'd be naive if we didn't think they were coming through in his playing. And yesterday I saw this interesting quote from Miles on Facebook, one of the jazz groups. And I was like, that's pretty telling. And so I actually looked it up, and I found a bunch of Miles quotes. And I want to just kind of delve into them quickly, just to kind of get some insight into him, and to see what you all think it says about him. You know, and Miles is a complex character. We all have our good and bad days. We all grow and change through life, you know, make adjustments in our way of thinking. And so Miles is a little contradictory here with some of these quotes, but I'm still going to read them off to you and discuss them and break them down a little bit one by one. So quote number 1. Sometimes you have to play a long time to be able to play like yourself. And there's nothing too revealing about that, aside from its honesty. And the fact that it does speak on Miles searching for his own sound and identity for a long time. And I've taken flack from people from saying that Miles, during his bebop era, during the cool years, you know, in the early days of hard bop, Miles is a guy that's not really in his own skin. He doesn't excel at playing bebop. Hard bop was more of a showcase for his sidemen. The modal, not the modal, but the cool early modern stuff, post bebop, he's kind of languidly searching for his identity. And it's really when he has the Ahmad Jamal via Count Basie recognition of minimalism, where Miles kind of finds his sound, he finds that mute, and he starts playing space and not playing. And that's where Miles really becomes the Miles Davis that we know and love. And he retains that even into the Wayne Shorter and Fusion years, although especially in the Fusion stuff, he starts to mask some of who his sound is to try to meld it into that cacophony that is Bitches Brew and some of those records. But even in the shorter years, he still is kind of more of a minimalist approach versus Tony Williams and Hancock and Shorter himself, who were incredibly dexterous, fluid players, who had a lot to say. And so it's nice to see Miles' honesty on that, you know. And when you listen to some of his early recordings like Dig and Lucky Thompson Walkin', you hear his progression, you know, and he starts to really find himself, I think, 55, 56, 54 even. He's in that era, Musings of Miles, where he really starts to come into his own. But that's something that every jazz player has to work his way through. So number 2, anybody can play. And this is the quote I saw yesterday. Anybody can play. The note is only 20%. The attitude of the motherfucker who plays it is 80%. And in Miles' way, he's exactly saying what I've often said. It's not the notes, it's not the style you're playing in. It's the attitude, i.e. the personality of the player who's playing it. And a guy like Hank Mobley can play the same chart as a John Coltrane, as a Dexter Gordon, as a Coleman Hawkins, as a Ben Webster, but each cat's personality is going to influence how they see that situation of notes. And their personalities will be inflected and earmarked on those phrasings. And so Miles is absolutely right. The attitude of a motherfucker is everything. And it's not what you play. It's the impact of your emotional context behind what you play. And it's also what makes white jazz players, for all their virtuosity, all their better recording studios and better tours and better payments, this is the one thing that does make them lesser at times. Because their emotional context isn't as taxed. It's not as strained. They're not as at the end of their rope. And the desperation of Black America, as I've said infinite times, is the fuel that makes those rockets burn so bright. And that can never be mistaken. We can't ever whitewash over that. And it's why when we look at those Playboy polls from the late 50s that were dominated by the white musicians who dominated the charts and the sales, why a lot of those names have slipped into total obscurity. And a lot of the blacks who lived in obscurity at those times have become the real luminaries of the music in posterity. It's because the context of their soul, the struggle of their group as a people, it has an honest cost. It's a powerful expression. And those of us with ears to hear things in Coltrane, in Miles, in Sonny Rollins, that the best white players are at best talking about their drug addictions, their women problems, their parental issues, which can all still be very taxing issues. But it's not quite the same as, gee, I hope I don't go to jail today or get shot. So it's a different experience. And so Miles is right on the head when he says it's the attitude of the motherfucker who's playing it. Quote number 3. People will go for anything they don't understand if it's got enough hype. And boy, Miles never spoke truer words than that. And I'm a victim of this. And as a young collector, I certainly fell victim to a lot of the hype. I feel like a lot of today's modern collector is absolutely at the whim and the mercy of the hype machine. Again, I'm going to get in a little hot water for this with some people, but a lot of the avant-garde fans, trust me, in 10, 15 years, you won't touch those records. You know, you won't. I went through the same process, and it's not something you're going to listen to the rest of your life. You know, and there's going to be an exception to that rule, but that exception will prove the rule. 95% of the people who embrace the avant-garde, it's a village you hung out in for a little bit on your vacation, but you ain't going to buy a house there. and it's challenging. It's got some definite emotional context and some pain to it. Some of it doesn't speak to me of pain. Some of it speaks to me of trying to sound pained, and trying to be. Some of it sounds phony to me, to be honest. But that's not the point. The point is that the hype machines behind all the video YouTubers and jazz groups hyping the avant-garde records that cost a lot, and the collectors paid $500, $700, $800 for a record, that makes a prestige around it. That makes young collectors think that that's what they need to be finding, and because the hype said this is what matters, I need to have it. And it must be good because people said so. And it's the same thing with Bitches Brew to me. And I was completely enamored with that record for years, thinking that this had to be, I was going to get it one day, and I never really did. It still sounds to me cacophonous and vacuous and emotionally stagnant. It smells funny. You know what I mean? And that's not some crystal clean blues water. That's a witch's pot, a bitch's brew. It's toil and trouble. Bubbles are happening. It stinks. It's not comfortable for my ears, my listening, and I listen to it hundreds of times, and it's to me a very dissonant mess, and I've spoken about it numerous times. Some people don't like to hear it and think they absolutely get it, and I'm sure some people actually do get it, but from everything I've read, you have to be a very advanced musical theorist to even really appreciate what some of the things that are happening on that record. And there's so much speaking over top of each other that it makes it easy to miss some of the things that are happening on that record. But the hype says it's got to be important, so one of the best records ever. I have to love it. Miles Davis' career in a nutshell is one of the most overhyped, sensationalized chapters in jazz. He's a part of the story. He's not king of the land. He never was. He never really should be. He's an important element. His universe is vast and has a lot of impact, and he did make a lot of inroads, and he certainly helped sell post-bop jazz to the world as good as anybody did. But to conflagrate that with him being the king of the landscape is very much an unfair assertion versus all the other greats who toiled with him. And in some cases toiled in spite of him. Miles was a very difficult person, but even here he says people will go for anything they don't understand if it's got enough hype. And I think that's in a nutshell very true for a lot of chapters of jazz. I think Ornette Coleman, the amount of hype he got, leads a lot of people to buy and purchase and think that they get it and love it. And I think people reevaluate that over time. And in the end, it comes down to how often do I really still play that record. And the first few Coleman records really aren't that out now in retrospect. But if you can listen to that double quartet Coltrane record, I think it's called Free, one with a little cutout on the die cut. If you can listen to that record once a week, or Coltrane's Ascension every week, you either have a very different chemistry in your brain than I do, or you have a lot of very cacophonious experiences happening in your own life. Because it's not really meant for that type of daily ingestion. And the hype, the cliche of it sometimes really attracts certain people into it. Number 4. For me, music and life are all about style. And Miles is very stylized. Miles very carefully built the mystique around the persona. And how he appeared, how he presented himself, to the meticulous effort he put into what sunglasses to wear, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The brothers Elton John with it. The brothers Elton John with the sunglasses. He's got some out there fashion. And different time frames have different fashions for sure, but he was always probably even a little ahead of the fashion and the look. Most of the cats seem to be in the 50s wearing the black suits and ties. He had more colorful jackets and more flamboyant looks. He loved to have white women on his arms and the fancy cars. And there's nothing wrong with any of it. But it does speak on the fact that music and life are all about style, as he says. And that some of what Miles is presenting is a persona. It is that cool cat with my back to the audience. And some of that was a real aversion to his audience. I think he felt that aversion towards his bandmates at times. A very difficult personality that was often at odds with itself, it feels like. I think Miles has a strong degree of self-loathing. Being a small, diminutive black male in America where the black male is kind of the bull with the biggest horns, coming from affluence and comfort versus the daily struggle, I think in some ways he found heroin to fit in. Just when you look at his personality, who he is, he's making a lot of conscious choices to present himself the way he does. And eventually he presents himself to white America in a very calculated way that I would compare it to Prince. Prince knew exactly the lines he needed to draw in order to make music sound and look a way that white America would buy it and gobble it up. And like Prince, Miles was able to do it in such a way that he didn't completely alienate his black following. And Prince was brilliant at that. There's very few cats in R&B that were able to cross that line as effectively and transition into being a crossover pop artist, selling to white people, yet still doing as really as possibly in the black charts and R&B charts and community. When Whitney Houston crosses over, they often lose their black card, as it were. And Miles and Prince both do a pretty good job of not alienating the black community in order to still sell the volumes they want to sell to the white community. I think Miles definitely alienated the black community at times. But some of that was just probably a resentment on their part of his more affluent lifestyle and his showing it off as much as he did. He certainly flaunts that comfort. Number 5. And this is one of the most telling quotes on this list, and it ties into what we just spoke about on some degree. If someone told me I only had an hour to live, I'd spend it choking a white man, and I'd do it nice and slow. That's Black Panther-like, only the Black Panthers weren't that militant. They were more about school lunches and books, believe it or not. That's some pretty militant-sounding stuff, laced with insecurity and resentment. I've said a few times over the years that when I listen to Miles, I often feel like he's saying to me through his horn, even on things like Sketches of Spain, fuck you, white boy. Buy my record, give me your money, but fuck you, white boy. That's what his personality, his facial, his history, the stories of his musician, everything that I know about him, when I'm listening to him and just trying to feel what this cat is saying, every once in a while it just feels to be this emotional outburst from him saying, I'm playing this for white people to make money, and I just want to take your money, but don't think we friends. You know what I mean? I got your little Sketches of Spain here, your little dancing bull. Ain't you happy with it? Woo! But I know you still think of me as a nigger, and so you ain't my friend. And so that resentment, I feel like, is oozing through him on a consistent basis. And for him to say, and again, I didn't look up any of these quotes to make sure I didn't fact check them. I just Googled some Miles Davis quotes, wrote down the ones I thought were interesting. A lot of them are kind of similar in some context, but I've heard most of these quotes before over the years, seen them in documentaries, and so I think most of them are legitimate quotes. And this one's probably the most challenging of the bunch. You know, if someone told me I had an hour to live, I would spend it choking a white man, and I'd do it nice and slow. Something Armstrong would never have said. Ellington wouldn't have said that. Count Basie wouldn't have said that. Parker and Dizzy would never have said that. Coltrane would never have said that. Pharoah Sanders would never have said that. When you want to talk about acerbic and bitter and unforgiving and resentful, it's laced through him. And I don't think for a second he's not saying fuck you to me at times. It just seems like that's coming through his horn. You know, and when he seems to be having a bad day, and he suffered a lot from some pain issues, he suffered a lot from broken hearts, he had a lot of female dalliances and a lot of struggles with the emotional outcome of his relationships. And when we get in low points, we often find other groups to lash out at. And I feel like I've taken a few lashes from Miles Horn. Part of being a throat grabber is hearing that motherfucker reaching out and talking to you and saying, this is how I feel right now. And there was days in the studio where I'd be shocked if he wouldn't openly admit to this. Where part of his attitude was, I know I'm playing some kind of wishy-washy music right now that white folks are going to buy up, but that's what I need to do to make this money. And at the end of the day, I'm willing to make that compromise. I signed with Columbia for that reason, to make money, not to have the big studio overseeing what I'm doing. That was the end result of signing with them. You know, and he wanted to have some different ground to cover. You know, I already wanted to explore different things. But the man says what he says. You know, I mean, I didn't put that in there. That's what he said. He would choke, and he would do it nice and slow. So he's not just going to go for a quick choke move, knock you out like Spock. He's going to sit there and he's going to milk that choking. And so there's some bitterness in that guy that informs his acerbic tone. His tonality is reflecting that somber, melancholy, bitterness. The blues and the purples and the greens that come out of his horn are a reflection of a dark, stormy guy who has some insecurity, and that insecurity leads to some fear and hate. And I'm okay with it. It's who he is, and he's not wrong for feeling what he feels. And I think there's other black guys who would openly say they got some issues with white America, but I don't think they would have ever shared that quote. You got to be Jack Johnson in a throne. You have to have ascended to a high place to have the audacity to express those words. But I think it's incredibly enlightening as to who Miles Davis is and was. And it speaks, in his own words, it's telling us how he feels. And number 6, don't worry about playing lots of notes. Just find the pretty ones. And this, I'm going to couple with another quote where he says, don't play what's there, play what's not there. And as I've said before, he heard about Jamal's kind of minimalist approach on the piano, the spacing, the color that space can provide. Emptiness can provide attention. Emptiness in and of itself can provide a dissonance. And Miles grasped that as good as any player in modern jazz. You know, he really understood that playing a few sour notes and then letting them just languidly hang in the air like a wet smoke to cloud our vision for a minute and then let it fade into nothing. There's a darkness in space. There's an emptiness that has an emotional context. And Coltrane, for all of his brilliance, is shedding so much light every note he plays that the room never really gets dark. If you think of every little note as a piece of energy, and energy is light, Coltrane's, you could read a book by Coltrane. See what I'm saying? He's putting enough in that room when he plays that it ain't gonna ever get too dark too long where I'm not gonna be able to make out your facial features. Coltrane's got a lot of energy. That's true for the Dolphys and for most of the hard bop cats, most of the avant-garde cats. That's not all of them, but even Ornette Coleman. There's a lot of energy and a lot of illumination from that luxury of notes. It's the minimalist approach that allows the dark to come in. And when it's dark, a single sound can have more impact than a flurry of sounds in the daylight. Oh, I can see what's going on around me. I can put an eye to all the things I hear, so there's no need to fear. But in the dark, that single sound can have an eerie, haunting effect. So the minimalism of Miles, that open space between notes, it's what gives you as a listener time to think of how dreary I suddenly feel, how haunted this place seems to be. It's an interesting and important dichotomy. The light of an illumination of a lot of energy being displayed versus the kind of dark shadows of a quiet minimalism. And so Miles is absolutely right. He's absolutely right. And don't worry about playing lots of notes, just find the pretty ones. And that certainly informs his mid-career point. Whether it's with Coltrane and that great quintet, Seven Steps to Heaven era, where he's kind of looking for his next identity. I think he has some wonderful, tonally impactful phrasings. That just, it's the perfect. Bye Bye Blackbird to me is another great example of him just finding the right pretty notes. And he's not going to add in all that flurry that Charlie Parker or Dizzy Gillespie or John Coltrane will. He's going to leave it there to have it sit. And it's going to sit there like a puddle of something. And you're going to have to factor it in and make it part of your day because that puddle ain't going nowhere. Sometimes there's so much light from a Coltrane or Parker that each note is actually reducing its impact. And the next light's already come, so the light from that previous energy has escaped, and you never really had time to really grasp it or sit with it. You can miss a lot of Coltrane ideas going through Chasing the Train. It takes a while to digest Chasing the Train. When you listen to Miles at his best, that powerful minimalism, it can leave you with an emotional impact on first listen, which is what he does as good as anybody. Excuse me. Number 7. Do not fear. Do not fear mistakes. There are none. And when you hit a wrong note, it's the next one that makes it good or bad. And he's again right on that. And I feel like Miles is often kind of slurring and bending notes, looking for the one he wants to end on. So he's probably quite familiar with being, ooh, I bent it there, I'm not really happy with it, let me go, and he'll slur it somewhere else. But, of course, Parker's the one, and Monk even, were the ones who really kind of inform us that wrong notes can be resolved back into the melody to use the scales. And, understand what bebop was saying. And without breaking down the mathematics, they had all of the notes of the scale that the song is in. So that when we're in that key, I know I can play that entire scale. And even though some of these notes aren't part of the chords right now, I can still resolve it back in and get back to my head and make it all make sense. So bebop kind of was the one who really pushed that on. And I'm sure Dizzy probably drove that home to young Miles. And Miles took it to his minimalism and uses it to create emotional context a lot by slurring and bending, almost searching for his endings. Unlike a Clifford Brown or a Freddie Hubbard, who race through their phrasing and leave themselves enough energy to finish the phrase that they're on, but they know where they're going to end. Miles seems to kind of just pause and slur and bend, and almost with a question mark. Maybe we'll come back down in here. Like, there's question marks in his playing. You'll hear it. You'll just be like, he's not sure. He's not sure. And I think some of that is intentional. I think some of it's a byproduct of exploration and rehearsal and practice and ability. But I think some of it's also very much intentional, dissonant, thoughtful pausings, and notes that were bent and left. And you listen to some of the great guitar players, they bend notes a lot to create extra tension and resolve. And when they release that bend, it comes back up to the happy place. And so Miles is often giving you that little bit of tension and then slurring back up to the resolve to give you that contentment mathematically as a listener. When we resolve, the fractions are back in harmony, and the numbers are adding up. And when you have a number that's not resolved properly, it does create that dissonance. And so mathematics are definitely involved with this entire process. And some cats knew it mathematically like Dizzy did. Other cats do it more instinctively. And I think Miles is somewhere in the middle. There's no way he didn't have endless instruction from Dizzy. From everything I've ever read about Dizzy, he was constantly teaching everybody around him. Understand the music, understand the math. And Miles did go to Juilliard as well for a little while. He didn't stay long, mind you. But Miles certainly knew his theory and had some graspings of it. But Parker and Dizzy definitely were teaching the young Miles a lot that Juilliard could not teach him. And so number 8 on my list, I think this is a great summation to the entire piece. Tone is stored in the balls. And again, it kind of refracts back to some of the other statements here about personality. It has a great impact on how you approach your instrument. The gentleness of Hank Mobley versus the tenacity and spiritual quest of Coltrane mean that their tenor saxophones aren't going to sound anywhere near the same. That's an important thing to grasp. That personality, that stored in the balls, as Miles says, what's in your balls is your life's experience, your emotional makeup, your environment, and your balls are going to kind of release that based off who your balls are. And so it's absolutely a crystal clear statement in terms of a guy can't really fake and play like he's not. And if you do, you will sound phony. And that's one of the things that's so refreshing to me about jazz, is its honest reflection of the artist who's making it. So many artists, both as painters and sculptors and as musicians and as writers, spend a lot of time faking, either trying to be commercial or trying to be impactful but not being honest. A jazz musician can't really put his horn to his mouth. And I'm going to give you what my wife thinks or what my friends feel. I'm going to speak from a voice that ain't mine. It's not real. I'm not going to. At most, you can try to tone down who you are, often for commercial gain. But even that's a compromise. That's a tough thing to do. And I would argue most of the ones who were successful always maintained a great degree of honesty and self-introspection in their playing. And Miles, for all of his commercial success, was still always being Miles. You know, did he make some compromises? Yeah, I think he did. But do I think he was being dishonest when he was playing those? No. I think he's playing that European music and that music for white folks, Porgy and Bess, and it's filled with, here you go, Whitey. Go and buy that for $4 or $5. I'm going to take home my 32 cents, whatever it was. I'm going to buy me a nice car. You know? So, and again, I don't want people to come away from this thinking I love Miles. I love his honesty. I love his fuck you attitude towards the world. I love his fuck you attitude towards white America. And to be honest, it's interesting that more black males didn't have quite so direct a fuck you attitude towards white America. And I think the biggest factor in that is the fact he came from a middle class affluence. And so he had privilege, as limited as it was, he had privilege. And that upper platform that he was born on made him look around, seeing he had it better than a lot of white cats even. And yet these broke white cats who had nothing were still condescending to him. And it's very insulting. When you've worked hard, you've built yourself up, and you've created yourself a career, and some broke-ass three-toothed motherfucker is calling you a nigger. That's tough. And I don't think a lot of the other black cats in that time frame felt they had the audacity or the platform to say anything else except for internalize it and then emote it in sorrow and pain. Miles, coming from where he came from, felt like he had a bit more of a platform. I can also afford an attorney. And one of the true hallmarks of privilege is having an attorney on retainer. I'll tell you what, the things that you will say and be willing to do when you know you got a lawyer in your corner versus a guy that can't afford one who's going to have to rely on county help. Even as a DJ, when we did the Trig Soul night and we had 300 black folks showing up, it was often the few white cats who would show up who would got in trouble with the police. Because we had to have cops there after a couple of years, not because we had problems, but just because we had a lot of blacks congregating. And so the white people in the community had complained enough to the city and the police department that we had to have 2 cops on duty stationed there for trouble. And like I said, we didn't have fights, we didn't have shootings, we didn't have trouble. Our biggest trouble was often a drunk white guy and his girlfriend or his buddy arguing over whose beer was whose, in the parking lot arguing over some... We had a lot of whites start fights. That was our biggest problem. And I never ever, in 15 years of DJing, have I seen a black man really accost a security bouncer, let alone a cop. They know they'll go to jail if they do. So it's very much... Keep my hands on my side. Yes, sir. Sorry. We're just going to head home. We don't want to cause no trouble. That's the general rule that I saw in my experience. A white dude whose dad's got a lawyer in his pocket doesn't mind poking a cop in the chest saying, "Fuck you, cop. I'll have your badge." Do you know who my dad is? That's privilege. That's what privilege looks like. To disrespect authority and the people who are trying to keep order, to dismiss them and act as they have no authority over you, that's a true sign of privilege. And so a guy with a lawyer, a guy with money, is willing to be a little more risky in what he'll say. And Miles definitely said some things that were charged socially, racially, musically. What an interesting cat. And nothing else, his place at the center of the Jazz Kingdom today, he's an interesting person to speak on. You can always go back and talk about Miles a little bit and find something interesting to say about him. Fun little soundtrack. Some of the rhythm tracks sound a little dated, a little 80s, you know, but it's still some languid Miles playing, and a worthy listen if you find it. Hope y'all enjoyed that episode on Miles Quotations. I got some fun things coming in the pike here. I'm going to do something on Blue Note 1500 series coming up. I've pulled the records out, and we're going to start taking the photos of them so I can make my slides. Y'all be safe. You have a great Monday. We'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.